I was just thinking earlier on, my daughter's just done her GCSE Spanish A*, and I had to get help at the train station to get a ticket to get here. So I can't tell. I think it's supposed to be animation.
Is it not that one down?
Ah, must be. Thank you. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. I think what we're hearing, there'll be a bit of a theme as you listen to different people, and I think the beauty of this is it's about the diversity with which we're representing our work and our experiences, but you'll see some common threads throughout this. So one of the things I was just thinking of, which I hadn't really thought of before, to be honest, was that, so am I the son of Pakistani expats, or am I the son of migrants in Britain, of immigrants? And it was just kind of making me think that it's the language that we use. So Charlotte, as you're talking about language, is that we often use language without really thinking about the words that we might use. So actually it was making me think, am I son of immigrants or am I son of expats? Because we would certainly talk about some of our communities from back home here in Spain. So that's something just to kind of plant in people's head as I move through. So I've took a bit of a take, a little bit of academic stuff in there, but most of it kind of relates to my experience of working with minority communities, particularly in Bradford. Who are the minority communities and why? And what are they doing in Europe? So one of the things, again, for Britain, as I said, I relate it to Britain, is that Britain's had a diverse background of communities for a very long time, so it's not just from the 50s and the 60s and 70s. But why were they there? They were there because there were jobs, so people like my father came to do jobs in textile at Nikes that actually white men and women in Britain didn't want to do. Sometimes people might say, well, actually, so shouldn't your mother have learned English? Well, actually, she raised 7 kids, all of them who pay taxes, so even though she doesn't speak English, she has contributed to society. Another twist on this, we were talking about this morning, was that my mother doesn't really speak English, she speaks Punjabi. My, be 13 on Friday, son, speaks English, very, very little Punjabi. But actually the two talk to each other. Mum talks in Punjabi, he understands, answers in English, she understands. But you ask both of them, do they speak the other language? And they don't. So again, there's something about how we communicate beyond words. And then just kind of, everybody will know this, what's diversity and these communities, and they're a huge mix. Then I was sort of thinking, I know this isn't about kind of teaching grannies or cookies kind of situation, but what do we mean by interculture? What's interculturalism? What is it about relationships? And therefore, what are the competencies that we should be talking about? And that relates to things like cultural competency as opposed to cultural awareness. So, I don't know, that's an Arab. So what's an Arab? But actually the competencies would be around, what might be the likes and the dislikes, and, how do they, greet each other? Is it okay to shake your hand? Isn't it okay to shake your hand? But what's the key behind all this? It's about giving people a person-centred approach. And something in my PhD that's starting to kind of explore is around family-centred approaches, because there will be things around power dynamics within families and who has what say and who gets to say what. So it's something a bit broader than just face value. Why intercultural care? I know people can read it off there kind of themselves in the sense, but not only are we aging as a European society, but those migrants that came across Europe, most of them are in that age profile where they themselves are now in the older population. I think somebody earlier on during the day asked about at what age is older, and again in Britain we've gone from 65 plus, then we've said 50 plus is older people, then we've said we have 80 plus is old, and 50 plus is young old. So I don't think there's ever really any real definition of that. But the point is, it's an aging community. Amongst the minority communities, it's aging. But if the likelihood of dementia is there as you get older, where do the BME communities go? Who do they go to for help and support? If there is no word for dementia across most communities, certainly in the South Asian communities that I've worked with across 5 main languages, there's no word for dementia. How do we start talking about things when the communities themselves are talking about complex health, managing the diabetes, the coronary heart disease, depression, stress from the kids because the kids are speaking a different language, they're on their smartphones. My mum often says to us, when you come to visit me, do you come to tweet or whatever, or do you come to talk to us? And actually it's true. So sometimes we've even talked about maybe we should have a box and everybody puts the phone in. Hasn't happened as yet. But the point is that families have different priorities sometimes. I won't really talk much about deprivation, that's been touched earlier on, but obviously that impacts access to care, access to support, whether you can buy services and so forth. There is a legislation kind of perspective of having to provide equality, but is that the reason why we should be providing it? Should legislation have to force us? That's particularly for the public sector. But I think more than that really, it's about what are the social constructions? So how do people form ideas, and what is dementia, what is health, what is access to care, what is the role of the family, how is that kind of put together? And often for migrant communities, it's what they bring with them when they've come, and of course then what they pass on to their children. So what's the issue? Often people talk about equality, and there's research that says, service providers say our doors are open. So yeah, their doors are open, they give everybody a box. But actually, equity is about, so people like me would need 2 boxes ready to see over the fence, is that if you want to provide a service that everybody can access, it's about equity, it's not about equality, and there's a real difference there. And that, I pinched it off Google, so credit to whoever came up with that. But in fact, the next one has a web thing on the end. But the reality of that is that those that have lots of access, and those that don't are not even at a starting point. So what we might do is, when we might talk about communities, is to go with those people who either have that box to be able to access, or actually have got lots of access and they become the spokespeople for that community. And actually it becomes their agenda, and the ones that are isolated at home, that are ill, have got no family to support them, will be like the chap at the end, that they don't even have a box to stand on. So that's something worth thinking about. I'm just going to quickly just sort of run through this, because some of this stuff's been touched on earlier on. But the one thing that would pick out there, in fact I'll pick 2 out there as people can read for themselves. One is that if we'd said that there's going to be a 7-8-fold increase in cancer, we'd all say, whoa. But actually for these minority communities, we are talking about a 7-8-fold increase in dementia. If those services aren't there, if there isn't awareness amongst practitioners, so whether that's your social worker, your GP, your community development worker, if we don't understand what can help some of these families and what ought to help these families, what are we going to do with these people? And that again will be across all communities. And this other thing which, unfortunately last year there was a minister that said this at a conference, is that we should learn from the ethnic minorities because they look after their own. For 20 years I've worked in social services. I've always tried to tackle that. That is no different to you or I with our kind of stresses of, day, family, whatever else might be going on. Do we have the time to provide that service? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But actually that's not about minorities, that's about families. So it takes me back to family-centred care. And just this thing about sort of voices, that it's important to have the right voices in the right places to be able to contribute and make a difference. But if we don't get that right, then there's a whole host of consequences. Some of them have kind of touched on. But what we do know is that most of the BME people are missing the point of service. They're not there. And we'll have people sort of say, well, why don't they use our services? Well, actually, talk to them. They present late. Why? Because they don't know that it's dementia, or they don't know what services might be out there. Diagnosis is often inaccurate. You've seen that picture of the clock, but if you ask, I don't know, somebody like my mum, in February, what season is it? It depends whether the sun's out and the flowers are there, or whether there's snow out there. So she'll either say it's winter or she'll say it's summer. So it's also about sort of education and that kind of conceptual thinking. In terms of burdens, do they look after themselves, or is it about being a traditional carer? It's virtuous, you're happy to care, or is it the fact that you're actually managing burden? So typically, this is very generalising here, but typically it might be like a daughter-in-law in the family that has having to manage your kids, or husband sort of says, "Where's my dinner?" Your mother-in-law sort of says, I don't know, father-in-law needs medicine, whatever. Where does that poor thing, find herself? Who's going to talk to her and ask her, what does she think about caring? Because it'll be somebody else there that'll be the spokesperson. And this thing about fear of perceived prejudice or discrimination. Some people may kind of not see that, but all of us have some kind of inbuilt either prejudice or fear, whatever it might be. And it's how we judge the other. So when I said earlier on about language and migrants and things, so sometimes, sat back at home when we're talking about the English moving to south of Spain, we always talk about expats. But all the communities that move to England are always migrants. That's why we're kind of like thinking about where do I pitch that. Transitions really, I was just kind of linking it back to the PhD, that actually all this links in two ways. One is whether it's about the change in your level of care, and the other one is about whether we're moving, so if it's a transition place of care. But what's the significance for us? So in Bradford, for example, we have this drive around home first. So we want people to be in their own homes, living happier, healthier, they can access services. But actually, if those services don't exist, where do those communities go? So if I talk to somebody and they says, yes, I accept it's dementia, yes, we need some help and care and I can't manage, where do you refer these people? Okay, moving on. And then just in terms of trying to kind of give an idea of what sort of implications do we have. So we talk about Bradford being one of the youngest cities in Europe, or is about to be the youngest city in Europe. But actually people don't talk about the ageing community that's also in the city. So we're kind of moving towards regeneration and education and employment training. But what about that care? We're also moving towards a generalised view of health and social care. And I think the problem with that is that we're going to be bypassing things like dementia. And we tend to see things in a one-size-fits-all. We've got a service, people can access that. Actually, if we're talking, and a real example is I approached my GP once and I says, can we work on people with dementia in our community? He says, well, actually, we're managing diabetes and coronary heart disease. I says, what about dementia? He says, well, they're in nursing homes. But what do you say to that? Another kind of allied issue with that might be that we often talk about high rates of DNA, so people did not attend their appointment. Either they don't go there or they don't return. But it's only very recent we're starting to record ethnicity. So if we're not recording ethnicity, how do we know who comes before we even start to talk to them and say, why didn't you come? And it might be that, the place isn't right. And a parallel thing that kind of comes to mind is some years back, we used to have this trailer that comes in the community, penile breast screening, and women would go in for screening. So if you saw somebody else's mum, went in, you knew it. So what do? Services moved indoors, so they're in health centres, hospitals. So again, we have to think about things that need to be culturally appropriate, and often the simple things that are needed to be done. And another one that's really funny, I find it quite funny, but in a sad sense, is that sometimes people think that they're doing something good. So equality says information's got to be available in the languages and so forth. So our local CCG, and I raised it with them, translate material. I look at this font, and it's not an easily readable font. I raised it with them, but no, because nationally they use that font, they'll use that font. And I tell them, go pick any newspaper up in Urdu, it's a different font. So actually, how much are people accessing that information? Or are we just investing money into something that may not even be being used by those communities? Again, I wanted to kind of link it back to my own kind of experience, is that I've been running something called Miriyade, meaning my memories, for something like 12 years. So how do we build that intercultural stuff? People were telling me that, the Pakistanis and the Indians wouldn't sit together. Men and women wouldn't sit together. So what I did was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and I said to the communities that take it or leave it. You either want the help of the service, or you can be stuck up and you sit at home. Now, I know some people may not be brave enough to kind of speak to communities like that, but I think sometimes it's about pushing boundaries a little bit, both ways, to say, can we make things work? And actually, we've had fantastic work with that group. That project itself was supposed to be 2 years through an investor save, but it's been running at least 12 years. And the rest of it kind of speaks for itself in terms of, if it's going to be intercultural, what do we do? It's how do we raise that awareness? Who do we go to talk to? How do we talk to them? This kind of community development approach is about saying, look, I'm not the expert. And, just sort of sat there, thinking, well, I might be doing a PhD, but there's no references on there on my presentation. If anybody wants any, I'm happy to provide those. But it's about what take might we have. So I'm one of those that'll just roll up my sleeves and say, right, I'll mop up if I have to. Then some people in the community that might be saying, well, actually, I can't be doing this. I'm a so-and-so, and, some social standing in communities. But what we try to just do with some of our service users, if you like, for want of a better word, is get people involved in some research and get them involved in conferences, because then you start to see diversity. often in England, particularly back in Britain, we tend to see minority in terms of colour. I was saying to some colleagues earlier on, if you're Welsh, Irish, Scottish, but you're in England, but then what if we all just picked ourselves up now and went to Dubai? Do we all become migrants? Do we know the language? Do we know how to access services? And the kind of things that would go through our head, perhaps those are the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of how people different to us might access services. But so it's important that people are there to kind of tell us. And just kind of as I tie that up, and this is actually thanks to Alzheimer's Society in Britain, that they funded some dementia doctoral training centres, and Bradford University is one of those. And I'm one of the sort of students there. And what I'm trying to look at here is, how do these relatives, how do the family carers manage transitions in care? What are the push-pull factors? What helps them? What are the barriers? What are the facilitators? Who are the decision makers, really? And it's up to them to tell me what they think are the push-pull factors rather than me telling. And then finally, one bit of it was with former carers. What I'm looking now is with current carers. And I'm sure slides will be available, but my contact details are there. So if anybody does want to follow up with anything or any questions, anything that you want to know, please ask. Thank you.